The more the evidence comes in, it becomes clear that the epicenter of the cover-up of the uranium scandal, the cover-up of Hillary's email scandal, and the fabrication of Trump's meddling with Moscow scandal is all based in the FBI, really headquarters in the Hoover Building, and has become sort of the nerve center for this entire operation. There is a cabal in the FBI that's responsible for almost all of what we're hearing about these various scandals. It includes James Comey, the former director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, his predecessor as FBI director and the current special prosecutor, Rod Rosenstein, the deputy attorney general who appointed Mueller, Andrew McCabe, the number 2 guy in the FBI, who's still there, whose wife is a Democratic politician in Virginia who ran for state legislature and got $600,000 from Clinton allies to make her campaign viable. Sally Yates, the former deputy attorney general who single-handedly blocked Trump's order on foreign immigrants from terrorist countries. Peter Strzok, S-T-R-Z-O-K, who was the top FBI agent in most of these investigations, and who was having an affair with the other member of the cabal, Lisa Page, another FBI agent. And Page and Strzok exchanged emails and text messages highly derogatory about Trump and highly supportive of Hillary. When Mueller saw them, he had no alternative but to fire the two of them. And together they were very involved in this kind of the Bonnie and Clyde of all three of these scandals. Begin with Strzok. He led the investigation of Hillary's emails, even though the subsequent text messages with Lisa showed him to be a hopelessly entrenched Hillary partisan and enemy of Trump. In fact, Strzok was the one on the FBI staff that interviewed Hillary to get her responses to the email scandal. And when his staff prepared a memo of the results of their investigation into Hillary's email scandal, and the staff said that she was guilty of gross negligence, which is the statutory term that defines the crime of which Hillary was guilty, Strzok deleted gross negligence and put in the words extreme carelessness, which is not a basis for any prosecution, just a criticism. And it was he who made that substitution. He also played a key role in the Trump meddling scandal. He was in charge of Robert Campbell, who was the FBI informant who monitored the communications within the Russian uranium complex about their efforts to bribe and coerce and force a takeover of the uranium assets by Russia. And Campbell, whose 6 years of information is about to come out in a congressional hearing, found his evidence suppressed. He was forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and he was blocked from testifying before Congress. That's now been overridden, thank goodness. And it was Strzok who was in charge of him, and in charge of Strzok and in charge of the whole investigation were McCabe and Rosenstein. Before Rosenstein became the deputy attorney general, he was the U.S. attorney for the region, and in that capacity he supervised Strzok's investigation of Campbell. But this crew hid all of the evidence of bribery over uranium, all of the evidence of Russia having done everything it could to get that uranium supply, hid it, even while the U.S. Committee on Foreign Investments was assessing whether it was legal or not to sell 20% of our uranium supplies to the Russians, and did not let that information come before the committee or come out in public, even as the scandal raged, even as Peter Schweiker wrote the best-selling book Clinton Cash, and the New York Times ran a front-page story for 2 days in a row emphasizing the seriousness of this scandal. Those findings still were totally hidden. And also, this crowd played the key role in mousetrapping Mike Flynn. What happened was that after Flynn had spoken to the Russian ambassador, he got a call from Rosenstein saying that the FBI wanted to interview him about the call, and thinking it was just a routine interview or a debriefing or formality, which their tone implied. He did not hire an attorney. And it was in that interview with Strzok was the interviewer, that Flynn lied to the FBI in the opinion of Strzok. So the epicenter of these three scandals, the covering up of the bribery of Bill and Hillary by the Russians, and by the way, that bribery was enormous. 9 different people contributed $145 million to the Clinton Foundation, and Clinton got a $500,000 speaking fee for a speech in Moscow, all in the weeks before the U.S. Committee on Foreign Investment approved the uranium sale to Russia. So the FBI was the center of these three: the cover-up of the uranium scandal, the cover-up of Hillary's email, and the prosecution of Trump's meddling and Moscow allegations. It really is the FBI versus the United States electorate. Thanks for watching. There's increasing evidence that the FBI was deeply involved with the dossier authors at the time that the dossier was written, released, and given to the president. The cycle begins, as far as we know, in October, when Bruce Ohr, OHR, the number 4 guy at the Justice Department, title of Associate Attorney General, met with Christopher Steele, the British spy who was developing, the British ex-spy who was developing the dossier. That meeting took place, apparently, a little while before Mother Jones first published the facts about the dossier on October 31st. That was the only pre-election mention of the dossier in public. And the fact that it took place at about the same time that the Justice Department met with the dossier's author is very, very troubling. It suggests that the dossier's author and their colleagues and confederates in the FBI and the Justice Department were working hard at pushing this dossier out in public so as to torpedo Trump's chances in the election. Well, they failed. Trump was elected. Then they picked up Plan B, and its object was to try to discredit Trump after the election, during the transition, and if possible lead to his impeachment. Or the same guy who met with Steele met with Simpson, Steele's boss, who was in charge of Fusion, that had received money from Hillary to prepare the dossier against Trump. And that meeting took place around Thanksgiving. Now the dates fall one on top of the other. Around that same time, Steele, the spy, faxed Simpson, head of Fusion, his boss, a copy of the dossier. And at the same time, through a convoluted method, Steele got the dossier to Senator John McCain. So there are the dossier is in the hands of Fusion and in the hands of Senator McCain. At that point, Fusion, Simpson, met with Ohr from the Justice Department. What did they talk about? Undoubtedly, they spoke about the dossier. Those meetings were so important and so improper that they resulted in Ohr being demoted. He used to be in charge of organized crime investigations, and he was kicked down to a much lower job, a major step down for the number 4 guy in the Justice Department. These meetings raise very important questions. The first one, the main one, is what was the role of the FBI in formulating, developing, writing, and ultimately releasing this dossier? Were they involved in that? And did Ohr offer to pay Steele? We know that somebody offered Steele $50,000 to complete the dossier. Was that Ohr, the number 4 guy in the Justice Department? Remember, Ohr and Steele had a pre-existing relationship. Both of them were involved, and Simpson as well. All of them were involved in investigating organized crime. Ohr as the head of the FBI unit on it, Steele as the handler for Litvinenko, the Russian spy that was murdered, and Simpson was Ohr's colleague on a Justice Department working group on organized crime. So the three of them knew each other, and had a good relationship. That could have been why Steele was chosen in the first place to go ahead and prepare the dossier, because of that relationship with the Justice Department. Right after these meetings took place, particularly after the meeting between Simpson, in charge of Fusion, and Orr from the Justice Department, the final dossier appeared, the final of 18 documents that were issued that together constitute the dossier. And that one was written after those meetings took place. And it recounted a lot that was in the dossier and added a lot of new information, much of which has been proven to be untrue. Did the FBI feed that to Simpson and to Steele, that it appeared a week or two later in the dossier that was released at that point? These are very serious questions, and they come to the heart of this scandal, which is, did the government begin this entire process of trying to frame Trump for involvement with Putin? Did they work on releasing the dossier? Did they pay Simpson? Did they try to get the dossier out in public through the reporters that Fusion knew and paid with Hillary's money? Did it try to get this out in public? And was this entire so-called scandal, this entire thing that has conquered the nation's attention, a scandal fabricated in the Justice Department and the FBI? I think we caught a break. The Obama appointee judge who was assigned to handle the Flynn case has recused himself. We don't know why, but it's interesting. And in his place has been appointed Emmett Sullivan, another district court judge that works in D.C. And Sullivan may have ongoing jurisdiction over this entire investigation of the Flynn, Russia-Trump meddling scandal. That is very good news. He was appointed by Bill Clinton to the judiciary, and he was incredible when there was an attempt made to frame Senator Ted Stevens and get him and convict him of a crime. Stevens was tried, sentenced, defeated in re-election, and then afterwards the case was reopened by Sullivan because he saw all kinds of prosecutorial misconduct. And the prosecutorial misconduct rose to such a level that Judge Sullivan appointed a special prosecutor to investigate the Justice Department and demoted and fired a whole bunch of people there who were involved in the shenanigans that led to the Stevens conviction. Now, I think it's entirely possible that this guy is going to grab hold of this case and probe deeply into the dossier, into the FISA warrant, into the conversations between Flynn and Skorzak, who is the guy who was vehemently anti-Trump, who interviewed Flynn, to whom allegedly Flynn lied. I think he may get into all of this. We may have a new John Sirica on our hands. He was the courageous judge that did not accept the face value of the Watergate burglary being some Cuban exiles who decided to rob the DNC, but insisted on probing into details and got those details out. I hope that this guy is like that. He certainly was like that in the Ted Stevens case. Well, for once we caught a break. Thanks for watching. In light of the increasing evidence that the FBI is behind the cover-up of Hillary's emails, the cover-up of the Uranium 1 bribery scandal, and the promotion of this phony dossier about Trump and Moscow colluding, it's worth looking back in time to the last time the FBI tried to overthrow a president of the United States and succeeded. Now, bear in mind, I believe Nixon was guilty, and I believe Nixon should have been removed from office. But the process is worth studying because it really outlines the precedent for what's going on today. It's explained more fully in Rogue Spooks, the book that Eileen and I wrote. In 1973 and 74, J. Edgar Hoover was very sick, ending his 30-odd-year tenure as the head of the FBI. And as his death approached, his deputy FBI director, a guy named Mark Felt, moved into position and was quite confident of being appointed the new director. Felt had been really running the agency for a couple of years during Hoover's last illness. And when Hoover died, it was almost a formality that he would be appointed. But he wasn't. Nixon refused to appoint him and instead appointed a guy who had no qualifications and really was a terrible director, Patrick Gray. In fact, many people felt that he was a Tuesday to Thursday employee. When Felt was sidetracked, he learned about the Watergate burglary, which burst into public view in June of 1972, when the 72 election was nearing its peak. At that point, the Watergate burglary was seen as just a robbery. It was litigated in local criminal court in D.C., and there was no reason for anybody to pay attention to it. A bunch of guys burst into the Democratic committee and left. Just a routine burglary. But then Mark Felt, who was resentful against Nixon, got a hold of Woodward and Bernstein, the two Washington Post reporters, and told them, hey, take a closer look at this. And then over a period of a year, met repeatedly with them in a secret location, a parking garage in Washington, where he anonymously fed them information about the scandal and guided them step by step. His work became notorious under the code name Deep Throat, which is what Bernstein and Woodward called him. And Deep Throat's identity remained secret for 20 years until his recent death. A movie was out about him a little while ago. And on one level, Felt is a hero because he uncovered the fundamental corruption and paranoia and police state tactics of the Nixon administration. But on another level, it was a precedent of the FBI intervening to overthrow a president of the United States. And that's really what we're seeing now in the FBI's efforts in the email scandal, the uranium scandal, and the Russian meddling scandal, in which it's using the special prosecutor in much the same way that Mark Felt used Woodward and Bernstein to topple an elected president. Thanks for watching. The more the evidence comes in, it becomes clear that the epicenter of the cover-up of the uranium scandal, the cover-up of Hillary's email scandal, and the fabrication of Trump's meddling with Moscow scandal is all based in the FBI, really headquarters in the Hoover building, and has become sort of the nerve center for this entire operation. There is a cabal in the FBI that's responsible for almost all of what we're hearing about these various scandals. It includes James Comey, the former director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, his predecessor as FBI director and the current special prosecutor, Rod Rosenstein, the deputy attorney general who appointed Mueller, Andrew McCabe, the number 2 guy in the FBI, who's still there, whose wife is a Democratic politician in Virginia who ran for state legislature and got $600,000 from Clinton allies to make her campaign viable. Sally Yates, the former deputy attorney general who single-handedly blocked Trump's order on foreign immigrants from terrorist countries. Peter Strzok, S-T-R-Z-O-K, who was the top FBI agent in most of these investigations, and who was having an affair with the other member of the cabal, Lisa Page, another FBI agent. And Page and Strzok exchanged emails and text messages highly derogatory about Trump and highly supportive of Hillary. When Mueller saw them, he had no alternative but to fire the two of them. And together they were very involved in this kind of the Bonnie and Clyde of all three of these scandals. Begin with Strzok. He led the investigation of Hillary's emails, even though the subsequent text messages with Lisa showed him to be a hopelessly entrenched Hillary partisan and enemy of Trump. In fact, Strzok was the one on the FBI staff that interviewed Hillary to get her responses to the email scandal. And when his staff prepared a memo of the results of their investigation into Hillary's email scandal, and the staff said that she was guilty of gross negligence, which is the statutory term that defines the crime of which Hillary was guilty, Strzok deleted gross negligence and put in the words extreme carelessness, which is not a basis for any prosecution, just a criticism. And it was he who made that substitution. He also played the key role, a key role in the Trump meddling scandal. He was in charge of Robert Campbell, who was the FBI informant who monitored the communications within the Russian uranium complex about their efforts to bribe and coerce and force a takeover of the uranium assets by Russia. And Campbell, whose 6 years of information is about to come out in a congressional hearing, found his evidence suppressed. He was forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and he was blocked from testifying before Congress. That's now been overridden, thank goodness. And it was Strzok who was in charge of him, and in charge of Strzok and in charge of the whole investigation were McCabe and Rosenstein. Before Rosenstein became the Deputy Attorney General, he was the U.S. Attorney for the region, and in that capacity he supervised Strzok's investigation of Campbell. But this crew hid all of the evidence of bribery over uranium, all of the evidence of Russia having done everything it could to get that uranium supply, hid it, even while the U.S. Committee on Foreign Investments was assessing whether it was legal or not to sell 20% of our uranium supplies to the Russians, and did not let that information come before the committee or come out in public, even as the scandal raged, even as Peter Schweiker wrote the best-selling book Clinton Cash, and the New York Times ran a front-page story for 2 days in a row emphasizing the seriousness of this scandal. Those findings still were totally hidden. And also, this crowd played the key role in mousetrapping Mike Flynn. What happened was that after Flynn had spoken to the Russian ambassador, he got a call from Rosenstein saying that the FBI wanted to interview him about the call, and thinking it was just a routine interview or a debriefing or formality, which their tone implied. He did not hire an attorney. And it was in that interview with Strzok was the interviewer, that Flynn lied to the FBI in the opinion of Strzok. So the epicenter of these three scandals, the covering up of the bribery of Bill and Hillary by the Russians, and by the way, that bribery was enormous. 9 different people contributed $145 million to the Clinton Foundation, and Clinton got a $500,000 speaking fee for a speech in Moscow, all in the weeks before the U.S. Committee on Foreign Investment approved the uranium sale to Russia. So the FBI was the center of these three: the cover-up of the uranium scandal, the cover-up of Hillary's email, and the prosecution of Trump's meddling and Moscow allegations. It really is the FBI versus the United States electorate. Thanks for watching. While the phony scandal investigated by Mueller is gaining attention in Washington, the real scandal is going on as new details emerge about the Uranium One deal, where Russia acquired 20% of America's uranium deposits. Apparently, before that deal was consummated, $145 million somehow made its way into the Clinton Foundation pockets, largely generated by Frank Giustra, who was the Canadian mining executive, who by then was the minority shareholder in Uranium One. That's in addition to the $500,000, 3 or 4 months before the deal was approved, that Hillary Clinton voted for as part of the cabinet-level group that approved the sale. It also emerged that the guy at the FBI who was handling the informant, who was working on the bribery case against Russia in uranium, happened to be Rod Rosenstein, the now Deputy Attorney General, who appointed the special prosecutor in the first place. It's also clear that the payments to the Clinton Foundation violated the memo of understanding that Hillary Clinton signed on taking over as Secretary of State, which obliged them to consult an ethics committee on any activity with foreign governments or with foreign investors in the Clinton Foundation. So this scandal is mushrooming and will reach an apogee probably this week or next week. I've been saying that for a while, but it's coming soon, when Campbell, the FBI informant, testifies before Congress and lays all of this out. So one important motivation for Mueller to spring this indictment over nothing against Flynn was to try to get attention and the spotlight on himself so we wouldn't wander to the competing scandal, the real one. Thanks for watching. This guy Mueller is absolutely incredible. He's following the exact same trajectory that went on with Fitzpatrick, in the Valerie Plame scandal, where he's hired to investigate a scandal. He rolls up his sleeves, hires a huge staff, and then finds that nothing happened. And he's sort of embarrassed, needs to do something against someone, so he gets somebody like Scooter Libby, who testifies, who makes an omission in his testimony having nothing to do with covering up a crime, and indicts him for obstruction of justice and perjury, and gets a verdict. In this case, Libby was pardoned, but he can declare a victory even though he wasted a huge amount of money, and in this case, a massive amount of our attention. When you get down to it, there is no crime that underlies this whole thing. He's going to be indicting people like Flynn for obstruction of justice, for lying in an investigation that never would have happened if Mueller hadn't been appointed. The fact is, there is no underlying crime to obstruct justice about. They're talking about the Logan Act. Well, the Logan Act, as you know, was passed as part of the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798 and 99. It was so unpopular it cost John Adams the election. And it prohibits American citizens from negotiating with foreign governments. And there has never been a prosecution under it, or a conviction under it. There were some indictments, but no prosecutions and no convictions. The basic indictment was in 1802 of a farmer for saying that states should split off in the West and join with France. But even that wasn't prosecuted. And the phenomenon of incoming presidents intervening in the affairs of the last administration in foreign policy not only is not prohibited, it is done all the damn time. When Ronald Reagan was waiting to take office and the hostages were rotting in Iran, the Reagan people were in regular touch with Khomeini and the other Iranian officials to negotiate their release. That happened the day of Reagan's inauguration. In 1968, when Nixon was running against Humphrey, and Humphrey was the candidate of the Johnson administration, and Johnson was frantically trying last-minute peace moves to settle the Vietnam War while he was still president, so he could claim credit for it and have a happy ending to his administration. And Johnson had negotiated terms with the North Vietnamese and wanted the South Vietnamese to sign on to it. Henry Kissinger, acting on behalf of Richard Nixon, got in touch with General Thieu, who is the president of South Vietnam, to tell him, when we take office, we'll get you a better deal. So turn down this deal that Johnson negotiated and wait until Nixon takes power. That was the most extravagant violation of the Logan Act. Not only did he discuss a treaty and discuss terms with a foreign power, he totally undermined a negotiation then in progress, and he did it before he was president and before Kissinger was national security advisor. They did it during the campaign. Any stuff that Trump is accused of doing took place after Election Day. So give me a break. Flynn is being accused of violating an act that is never enforced and indeed honored in the breach. And he was pled guilty to a crime of covering up what wasn't a crime. And if that's all this investigation comes to, how ridiculous and obscene a waste of the nation's time this has been. The only reason it's happening is because the media wants something on Donald Trump. Thanks for watching. In yesterday's video, I discussed the ominous possibility that the Democrats and the liberal media may be working together to oust Donald Trump as president, if not through the collusion with Moscow allegation, then through the 25th Amendment to the Constitution that allows Congress to remove a president if he's judged to be mentally unfit or unstable in performing the duties of his office. Now, that amendment passed in 1967. But back in 1920, 1920 and 1921, there was just such a situation, but there was no constitutional provision for it with Woodrow Wilson. Wilson had been very active in negotiating the Treaty of Versailles, ending World War I, and in promoting the League of Nations, which was founded at the conference. There was huge opposition to the treaty and to the League of Nations among Republican and isolationist senators. And while its confirmation hung in the balance in the Senate, Wilson embarked on a national speaking tour to try to sell the League and the treaty to the American people. Very strenuous tour, usually involving 2 or even 3 speeches the same day, lasted for more than 30 days. At the end, the tour was terminated abruptly when Wilson had a stroke and was completely devastated by it. He lost the ability to speak. He was partially paralyzed, and it was just a tragic situation. He had no confidence in his vice president, a guy named Marshall, and there was no provision for presidential disability. So his wife, Edith Wilson, took over most of the duties of the president. Edith was a very important figure in Woodrow Wilson's life. Wilson was married to Ellen Wilson. Some historians have even said the similarity between Ellen and Edith was deliberate on Wilson's part. And he was very devoted to her. He took office in 1913. And when Ellen died in late 1914 or early 1915, Woodrow was completely devastated. But a year later, he had met and fallen in love with Edith Wilson. And after a year after Ellen's death, they were married. And during the war, Edith had a fairly symbolic role. She would go without meat on Mondays and without gas on Sundays and other stuff like that. She let the sheep graze on the White House lawn to save manpower and demonstrate the frugality that Americans were supposed to observe during World War I. But after Woodrow's stroke, Edith really moved into the role of president. She would decide what documents he would see, what information he would get. She would do the presenting. She would do the briefing. Nobody else was allowed in this, and nobody was allowed to see President Wilson, not even members of his cabinet. And at that point, there was a very tricky period going on when the Senate was negotiating the ratification of the League of Nations and of the Versailles Treaty in general. And many, many senators, particularly moderate Democrats and Republicans, felt that they basically approved of the League, but wanted certain amendments or certain changes in the structure to assure their vote for ratification. Particularly, they were concerned about surrendering American sovereignty to the League in things like declaring war and issues of that sort. And Woodrow was very stubborn about it, and after the stroke, much more stubborn. Many have believed that the stroke impaired his mental abilities and made it impossible for him to be a rational actor in those negotiations. In any case, he held the position of no modifications, no changes, no reservations at all. And the senators formulated a list of fairly moderate reservations that would be perfectly acceptable today, most likely, but Wilson steadfastly refused to touch them. And while it was clear that the treaty would have been ratified with those reservations, it could not be ratified without them. And the whole League died, the whole Treaty of Versailles died with it, was discredited with it, and it almost directly led to the events in Germany that led to World War II. And Edith Wilson was the one who kept communicating that the president wouldn't accept this, wouldn't accept that, wanted no changes at all. And the combination of a sick, rigid, arteriosclerotic man recovering from a stroke and a woman who was a strong enough woman to feel that she needed to buffer the outside world from him reinforced a politically tragic position by President Wilson. President Wilson served his term, ending in March of 1921, so there was effectively a 16 or 17-month period in which Mrs. Wilson really ran the country. The Republicans sneered that Wilson was the assistant president, and that Edith Wilson was the real president, and that was not far wrong. Thanks for watching. It's so interesting to watch the shenanigans the Democrats are going through as they assess the Trump tax cut proposals. They are so bent out of shape that they're going to raise the deficit, that they're going to expand the deficit using the money for tax cuts. Now, it was perfectly fine with them in the opening month of the Obama administration, when Obama just gave them a blank check to spend money on stimulus. And there were articles at the time that deficits no longer matter and that they're just going to go crazy spending money to try to avert unemployment. When the Democrats are given the option of spending money, they go completely crazy and they don't worry about the deficit. But when they're given the option of cutting taxes, they become punctilious and don't want to cut the taxes, don't want to spend too much in cutting the taxes, and are very worried about the impact on the deficit. Have you gotten the point that the Democrats want higher taxes and want more government spending and could care less about the impact on the deficit? And that the one thing they're opposed to is cutting taxes because it decreases the power of the federal government and their power as well. Nothing could be more evident than looking at this insane double standard going on now in Washington. Thanks for watching. If you're keeping a list of Clinton scandals, Bill and Hillary, I got one more for you. The investment in Green Tech to produce a green car. Green Tech was a company headed by Terry McAuliffe, who was the main fundraiser for Bill Clinton during his presidential years and a significant fundraiser for Hillary in the Senate races and the presidential race. Terry McAuliffe is coming off a term as governor of Virginia. But before that, he was head of Green Tech, which was a company dedicated toward producing all-electric cars that they called green cars. And at the very beginning of the process, he was running around trying to find investors in the company so that they could open shop and begin production. So he went to Bill Clinton, who was invited to China, one of several trips that the former president made, to give a bunch of speeches. And Bill brought Tony Rodham, Hillary's brother, and Terry McAuliffe along as his guests on this trip. And the Chinese government introduced them to a lot of wealthy Chinese who had a potential to invest in enterprises in the United States, specifically in McAuliffe's company. The investors wanted a return on their investment, but they also wanted visas to be able to enter and leave the United States as they wished. So they applied for visas under what's called the EB-2 program, that says that if you invest $500,000 in an American company, and as a result of your investment, at least 10 jobs are created, you can get an EB-2 visa. So in the hopes of the visa and of a profit, these Chinese investors invested $17 million. They told the government they were going to create 350 jobs. At their peak, they created 94, and there were only 10 left. The company produced no cars at all and is on the verge of filing for bankruptcy. The Chinese investors are raising hell, and they sued McAuliffe and Rodham, claiming that they were really defrauded of their money, saying the reason that they invested was that it was represented to them that Bill and Hillary Clinton and Terry McAuliffe and Hillary's brother could swing enough political clout to bring the deal about. They were successful in getting their visas, and not a single car was produced in this entire process. And they are suing for their money. In addition, the state of Mississippi, where the plant was located, chipped in money and also bought land and leased it for the factory. And they are suing for their money back and their property back, presumably. So this has a political relevance, both because it's one of a number of the Hillary Clinton scandals, and Bill related to the speaking fees, but also Terry McAuliffe has just finished his term as governor of Virginia and is rumored to be looking at a presidential race as the Democratic nominee in 2020. And McAuliffe is a dynamite fundraiser, raised millions for the Clintons, probably their chief fundraiser, and has to be taken seriously as a candidate. Now, I don't know if he has any other qualifications to be president, but he sure has the scandal part down pat. He plays this pay-for-play game as skillfully as anybody since Hillary Clinton. And this scandal will be hanging over his head and possibly hopefully preclude, a presidential race. Thanks for watching. The liberal media and the Democratic Party seem to be laying the basis for an effort to remove Donald Trump from office under the 25th Amendment, specifically the clauses in that relate to presidential mental disability. The history of it is the amendment was passed in 1967, and it provides that if 2/3 of Congress, of each house, agree, and the vice president agrees, Congress can remove the president for a period of time or permanently because of an inability to discharge the duties of his office. The president gets a voice in that, and he can reinstate himself. Then Congress can remove him, and the removal stands. The president at any point can ask for another vote on the situation, and it can come up again. But it's a procedure that's never been used and really never been thought of until the fierce opposition to Donald Trump arose. If you look at the media commentary that's going on and the political commentary, it all seems aimed at trying to prove that Trump is unstable, mentally perhaps psychotic, caloric, given to rages, and incapable of being president with any degree of safety. Democrats have even moved to try to change the law to take the nuclear trigger away from President Trump, something that's obviously unconstitutional. But almost every day we see a news story that basically is designed to fabricate the grounds for removing Trump. For example, the president recently posted videos of Muslims committing crimes and talked about how the terrorists are very often Muslims and how they've been linked to these kinds of crimes. It then came out that the crimes were committed 3 or 4 years ago and that the context wasn't given by the president. Normal mistake, something that could easily happen, but instead leaders abroad and in the media tried to use that as evidence of presidential dementia and being out of his mind. Increasingly, words like crazy, unstable, unpredictable emerge when they talk about President Trump. And the media is very alive for any evidence it can adduce to try to frame him, really, on charges of mental instability. This amounts to nothing more than a coup d'etat. In fact, Democrats in Congress have introduced a bill saying that there should be a commission established under the 25th Amendment to decide on the president's capacity to remain in office, and that commission would then make its recommendations to Congress, which could reaffirm them by a two-thirds vote and begin the process of presidential removal. This is absolutely nuts. President Trump is as far from diminished or insane or demented as you can possibly be. In fact, the evidence is that Trump has become more and more skillful at being president. I think he's playing North Korea very well. I think that he's finessed this tax cut bill in a marvelous way, and he's included Obamacare mandate repeal in it. His moves have been dazzling with their deftness and skill over the last couple of weeks and months. He seems truly to be growing into the job. But the Democrats are literally frothing at the mouth over this and are proposing a very undemocratic procedure for getting rid of Donald Trump. It smacks of a Latin American banana republic coup d'etat. I first warned about this about 5 months ago in one of these videos. And the more I've seen, the more the evidence is adduced to that. They're no longer saying Trump is extremist or is intolerant or anything else. They're simply saying that he's insane. And it is absolutely awful. It reminds me a little bit, actually, of the communist regimes in Russia always saying that their political opponents were insane, and instead of sending them to jail, locked them up in insane asylums. This is just unbelievable that this is going on in this country. Thanks for watching. In the 1990s, Congress passed legislation enabling a program to give key government employees a special perk of having their student loans repaid or forgiven by the federal government. And initially it was intended for the Defense Department and other sensitive agencies to recruit high-level talent, even though they got relatively small salaries as government workers. It was a key effort of trying to get and retain technical services in key areas like the Defense Department. But then Congress got a hold of it and decided to include as key employees who could receive this benefit senior staff in Congress, so that people who were asked to work for congressional committees or for congressmen or senators were eligible to receive these perks. We don't know how many received them. We do know that in 1 year, 2011, there were 5,100 people who got their student loans paid by the federal government under this program. We don't know how many of them worked for Congress, and we don't know whose staffs they were on. This is an outrageous perk. If you want to pay somebody a lot, pay them. Make it part of your budget. But don't make this a special hidden perk that you get if you work as a senior staff member in Congress. That's not how our government should be working. You know, many of us have difficulty paying our own student loans, and to have to pay those of half of Congress's staff in addition to our own is a little heavy. Thanks for watching. After he left the White House, Bill Clinton was paid $5.6 million to be co-chairman of the Business Backs Education Campaign, a campaign that was funded by the Crescent Group, which is a company that is owned by Saddam Hussein's nuclear missile expert, the guy who is in charge of Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapons program. At the same time, a subsidiary of Crescent, Gulf Tainer Company, got a 35-year lease from the Obama administration to operate Port Canaveral. Port Canaveral is adjacent to Cape Canaveral, the Kennedy Space Center, and the most active strategic base of the United States Air Force. Gulf Tainer is partially owned by a Russian company that makes Club K container cruise missile systems. That's a system that puts 8 cruise missiles in an ordinary-looking container, such as you see on trucks and ships all over the world, and can be exported in that container, and nobody can tell it's a cruise missile. So it can hide there, basically, hide in plain sight, if you will, with millions of other containers in every port in the world. And this system poses a tremendous threat to the United States, because the cruise missiles inside can be detonated remotely or detonated by satellite. So we have a company that paid Bill Clinton, and in return, or at the same time, got a 35-year lease to operate Port Canaveral, a tremendously sensitive facility right in the middle of America's strategic arsenal. And this sale, this lease, did not have to be approved by the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, the committee that approved the Uranium One deal. And the guy who said it didn't have to be approved was Secretary Lew, the former Treasury Secretary under Obama, and at the time in control of the Treasury, and Bill Clinton's former Chief of Staff. So put this together. Bill Clinton's former Chief of Staff and Obama's Treasury Secretary allowed the leasehold to go through without further scrutiny on Port Canaveral by a company called Gulf Tainer that was headed by Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapons expert and partially owned by a company that made containers for Russia which could ship cruise missiles around the world. Retired Navy Admiral and the former Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, James A. Lyons, wrote that this deal really threatens American security and makes us vulnerable through Port Canaveral to these cruise missiles going all over the country and all over the world. So we need to explore this deal. It's potentially as explosive and dangerous as the Uranium One deal, giving Russia control over 20% of our uranium deposits. And it may be connected to the $5.5 million Bill Clinton got and pocketed as direct income from this foundation effort. This is very troublesome and really needs to be investigated. Thanks for watching. One of the efforts of the Obama administration was to try to convince us that the criminal justice system was racist and biased against minorities, particularly against black men. And they would cite the statistic, for example, that half of all people in prison are black men, even though black men are only about 7% of the country's population. And amazingly, 13% of black men between 15 and 30 in age are in jail or in prison right now, at this moment, more than 1 out of 10. But that does not necessarily indicate racism. The facts are, the new statistics indicate, that 53% of all violent crimes are committed by black people, and a majority of the dead bodies found in murders and homicides are themselves black. The fact of the matter is that the people who commit the crimes are overwhelmingly and disproportionately minority. Interestingly, not Latino, but African American. And rather than criticize the criminal justice system, we should not think that cops are disproportionately arresting minorities or that judges are disproportionately sentencing them, or that juries are disproportionately judging them guilty. The facts are they are disproportionately committing the crimes in the first place, and that's the truth. Thanks for watching. The biggest threat to freedom of the press in the world is not always the government telling newspapers and periodicals what to write. In many countries like Russia and China, of course, that is. But in most of the rest of the world, the real danger is paying journalists to produce stories that the government or politicians or interest groups want them to run. It's one thing when a journalist brings his personal bias to something or his ideology to something, but at least an honestly felt view, and when they're simply taking money and taking dictation and publishing whatever the person that's paying them wants them to do. That's why the record of the payment of money from Hillary's campaign to Hillary's law firm to Fusion GPS, the negative research firm Hillary hired, to 3 journalists is very problematic, because it truly endangers the freedom of the press and clothes in First Amendment protection political propaganda masquerading as news. Now, we don't know who the journalists who got the money are, how much they got, and we don't know what they got it for. Fusion is trying to say they didn't get it for being bribed to run stories. They got it to pay them for research. And the best researchers in the world are journalists, and that's who we paid to dig up the stories. But those lines are fairly fuzzy, and the Fusion has refused to release the records of the payments to these journalists or to others, and was forced to do so by subpoena. We also don't know all of the story about who Fusion paid. We know that they got a little over $1 million from Hillary's campaign. And we know that they paid Christopher Steele, the British spy, $160,000 to concoct that phony dossier. But where did the other $800,000 go? We don't know. Some of it may have gone to journalists, some of it may have gone to other journalists. And it may be that on both ends of this crazy story about Russian collusion with Trump, there was a paid effort by Hillary Clinton to slant the news. On the one hand, she obviously, we know now, paid to amass the dossier and filled it with all kinds of garbage to try to discredit Trump. And now, perhaps at the other end of the process, she may have indirectly paid journalists to accept the story and to run it and to promote it. And the net result of this was a huge campaign issue against Trump that she ran with throughout the debates, and possibly, and certainly a special prosecutor, and possibly even impeachment, concocted by money paid by the Clinton campaign. This is the true meddling in our system that we need to worry about, not Russian meddling, but a political candidate bribing people to produce fake news and to get senators and congressmen and others to echo that call. This is the true meddling in our politics. It's not necessarily foreign intervention. It's a political candidate using her campaign money to get information and make up facts, disinformation about her opponent's campaign, and then possibly paying journalists to cover that disinformation and treat it as real. That's what we've got to worry about. Thanks for watching.
Former FBI Chief Robert Mueller covered up Bill and Hillary Clinton selling 20% of the North American uranium reserves to Russia. And in case you didn't get the memo, uranium is needed to make nuclear bombs. After 20 years of being the Clintons' chief political consultant, Dick Morris couldn't take it anymore and he converted from being a Democrat to a conservative Republican. Dick Morris says Bill Clinton took bribes in the form of $1 million speaking fee in exchange for former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton approving the treasonous sale of uranium-1 to Vladimir Putin. And it gets worse. Not only did Robert Mueller refuse to follow up on whistleblower evidence of Russia infiltrating the U.S. by way of the Clintons, but his successor FBI head Robert Comey did the same, looking the other way and refusing to investigate the true collusion with the Russians by the Clinton crime family. So, what the Clintons, Mueller and Comey do to divert attention away from their criminal collusion with the Russians? Simple, they fabricated a story accusing Donald Trump of colluding with the Russians, knowing their friends in the liberal mainstream media would gladly be their echo chamber. Wake up, America. Demand the Clintons are investigated and spend jail time for committing high treason against the United States of America.
Clean TV.
In the 18th and 19th century, the Democratic Party was primarily defined by racism. They were the party of the South, they were the party of the Confederacy, and during the years in the aftermath of the Civil War, they were the party opposing Reconstruction and favoring the maintenance of the pre-Civil War policies. The Democratic Party, however, changed fundamentally in 1896 when William Jennings Bryan, the populist, took over the party as its presidential candidate in 96, 1900, and 1908, losing all three times. And the Democratic Party became clearly the party not of the large Southern landowners, but of the small farmers, the populists, the Midwest Party. It shifted its geographic base from the South to the Midwest, to states like Nebraska and Kansas and Iowa and so on. Then along came Woodrow Wilson, who took that ideology and made it not just a liberal ideology for populists, for planters, for farmers, but also for urban workers and unionization. And Franklin Roosevelt completed that transition and literally made the Democratic Party the party of the poor and the Republican Party the party of the rich, which was the fundamental motif that characterized the party dialogue in this country from 1932 until the early 1970s. In 1974, the economic populism stopped being the basis of the Democratic Party, and social liberalism replaced it. The epicenter of the Democratic Party moved increasingly from the working class and union hall to Hollywood and Harvard, to the cultural elites, and increasingly also of the economic elites. The key event that triggered that was Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion, and after that the gay rights movement. Those forces moved the Democratic Party to become really less like the British Labour Party and more like the British Liberal Party, one that was not primarily concerned with economics, but concerned with its perception of social justice. That vacated an entire unit of American population, the lower white middle class, that had formerly been the core of the Democratic Party, that now was up for grabs. They faced a Republican Party that did not reflect their priorities, and a Democratic Party that increasingly ignored their priorities. Then stuff changed in the Nixon administration. Nixon attempted to exploit the ground vacated by the old Democratic Party, particularly its southern wing, and replace it with a new Republican ideology that he called the silent majority. Under Reagan, that shift continued, moving away from the posture of race and moving increasingly toward social conservatism based on opposition to abortion, opposition to gay rights, and a maintenance of traditional religious values in our society and our politics. But all of the Reagan move and the Nixon move before it was really to exploit the constituency the Democratic Party had abandoned. And that replacement reached its apogee in 2016 when Trump won a majority of the white working class vote, and the Democrats won a majority of the rich wealthy, educated vote. The parties completely flipped. Democrats became the party of the rich, and Republicans the party of the poor. The wild card, the outlier, was the black and Latino population that continued its democratic moorings because of their fear of Republican racism and sexism. But that constituency is the jump ball in our politics. And in winning that jump ball, Trump really laid the basis for the most important party realignment since Franklin Roosevelt. If you're looking for a really good Christmas present, our book, Rogue Spooks, would certainly fill the bill. In it, which we wrote back in the summer or the spring of this year, we document everything that we've learned since about the role of the intelligence community, the FBI, and the Clinton people in the effort to frame Donald Trump and prosecute him for something that never happened, coordination between Russia and the Trump campaign. We explain how it came about, how the dossier started, why the dossier is totally flawed, what the objective of the intelligence establishment, the deep state, was in fomenting this entire crisis, why Trump has had great difficulty getting rid of the people who are promoting this crisis and prosecuting those who've leaked in it. And it also explains how the CIA went from being the bastion of right-wing conservatism to being the ultimate leftist organization, and how the FBI went through a very similar journey, a complete remake under Obama. And then we explain how after Trump was elected, the FBI and the CIA liberals kept their jobs, many transformed to civil service jobs, in order that they could not be fired by Trump, and through leaking and lying could help oust him from office. So it's a good book. Get a hold of it. It's one of those few books that was written 6 months ago, half of which has come true, and the other half is about to come true. Thanks for watching. The most fundamental fact of American politics, the first thing an immigrant learns about this country, is that the Democrats are the party of the poor and the Republicans are the party of the rich. And in this division, we really echo the politics, not just of the Labour Party and the Conservative Party in Britain, but more interestingly, the party division in the Roman democracy, where the rich people were the patricians and the poor people were the plebeians. And that fundamental party division has come down through history and been bequeathed to being the core of the American democracy. Donald Trump is changing that. I defined triangulation back in the Clinton days as stealing the other side's agenda and implementing it, thereby undercutting the issue base of their party. But in this case, it goes far deeper than the issue base. Trump's tax cut and the triangulation that it brings with it is a fundamental assault on the Democratic Party's relationship with the working middle class of this country. It's aimed squarely at the people who make basically more than $50,000 household income, below which you basically pay no income tax, and up to about $70,000 or $80,000 of household income. And that group, the solid middle class of the country, is the group that is most benefited by this tax cut, by the virtual doubling, it looks like, of the child tax credit from $1,000 probably to $2,000, and the doubling of the standard deduction from $12,000 to $25,000 per person. Means that the broad swath of that middle class will not have to pay any income taxes at all. While the tax cut will probably reduce the top rate in a bone to the core of the Republican business base, the bulk of it is aimed at small businesses, family entrepreneurs, mom-and-pop stores, and low middle-income workers. While this is taking place, the Democratic Party has moved from a party that fights poverty to a party that fights racism. And race has increasingly become a proxy for wealth and income in the definition of poverty. So that the Democratic Party has almost totally turned its back on middle income and poor white people It's followed the mantra of affirmative action, which benefits women and blacks and Latinos, but says nothing about white men. In turning its back on the white lower middle class, on white poverty, the Democratic Party has created a huge vacancy in our political system and is increasingly filled with Trump voters. Remember, in the election of 2016, the most fundamental change of all that defined that election and the realignment that it kindled is that poor whites voted Republican and rich whites voted Democrat. The Democratic Party has moved from the party that represents the poor to the party of social change on issues such as abortion and gay rights, moving well away from their mandate. And Trump has moved in behind them to take over that vote and that ideology. And that is really the ultimate triangulation. Unlike Clinton's triangulation, which dealt with the superficial issues in our society of welfare reform and the balanced budget, this triangulation deals with the core message, the core essence of what it means to be a Republican. It's historic, it's very important, and it represents not just a tax cut, not just a budget, but a fundamental realignment of political and economic priorities. If you're looking for a really good Christmas present, our book, Rogue Spooks, would certainly fill the bill. In it, which we wrote back in the summer or the spring of this year, we document everything that we've learned since about the role of the intelligence community, the FBI, and the Clinton people in the effort to frame Donald Trump and prosecute him for something that never happened, coordination between Russia and the Trump campaign. We explain how it came about, how the dossier started, why the dossier is totally flawed, what the objective of the intelligence establishment, the deep state, was in fomenting this entire crisis, why Trump has had great difficulty getting rid of the people who are promoting this crisis and prosecuting those who've leaked in it. And it also explains how the CIA went from being the bastion of right-wing conservatism to being the ultimate leftist organization, and how the FBI went through a very similar journey, a complete remake under Obama. And then we explain how after Trump was elected, the FBI and the CIA liberals kept their jobs. Many transformed to civil service jobs in order that they could not be fired by Trump, and through leaking and lying could help oust him from office. So it's a good book. Get a hold of it. It's one of those few books that was written 6 months ago, which half of which has come true and the other half is about to come true.